The soft golden rays of the morning sun filtered through the trees, casting a warm glow over Oakwood Avenue, a quiet street in a small suburban town. The air was crisp, carrying the faint aroma of freshly baked bread from a nearby bakery. Evelyn Miss Eve Harris, a beloved grandmother in her mid-60s, stepped out of her modest home, wearing her signature gray cardigan and comfortable walking shoes. Her gentle demeanor and warm smile were as familiar to the neighborhood as the sound of birds chirping. Known for her kindness, Miss Eve had built a reputation for always helping others without expecting anything in return. This morning, like many others, Miss Eve had errands to run, not for herself, but for a sick neighbor who had been bedridden all week. With her sturdy sedan humming steadily beneath her hands, she made her way to the local pharmacy to pick up groceries and prescriptions. Her car, though old, was well maintained, much like the way Miss Eve carried herself, simple but full of character. As she pulled into the parking lot behind the pharmacy, she noticed a young mother struggling to juggle a crying toddler, a heavy diaper bag, and a stroller with a wobbly wheel. Miss Eve didn't hesitate for a moment. "Need a hand, sweetie?" she asked, her voice as soft and soothing as the breeze. The frazzled mother looked up, relief washing over her face. "Oh, thank you so much," she said, her voice trembling with gratitude. Miss Eve expertly balanced the diaper bag on one arm while gently patting the toddler's back with the other. Within moments, the child's cries softened to sniffles, and the mother managed a grateful smile. "You've got a strong little one here," Miss Eve said, handing the bag back to the mother with a wink. "Take care now." As she turned to head into the pharmacy, the sound of a revving engine broke the serene atmosphere. A black and white police cruiser suddenly jerked to a stop behind Miss Eve's car. Her heart skipped a beat as she turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered officer step out. The shiny badge on his chest glinted in the sunlight, and his hard expression immediately set her on edge. "Hey, you! Hands where I can see them," barked Officer Ethan Keller, his voice sharp and commanding. Miss Eve froze, her smile fading as confusion crept across her face. "Excuse me," she said, her voice steady but tinged with disbelief. The young mother with the toddler quickly ducked away, her eyes wide with fear. Passers-by paused, sensing trouble, but no one intervened. Keller's eyes scanned Miss Eve suspiciously, his hand hovering near his holster. "Suspicious activity," he muttered, narrowing his gaze. Miss Eve's heart sank. She had heard stories like this before, stories of good people wrongly accused, humiliated, or worse. Still, she kept her composure, determined not to let fear take over. Little did Officer Keller know, this was no ordinary grandmother. The tension in the parking lot thickened as Officer Keller's commanding voice echoed off the nearby buildings. Miss Eve stood by her car, her hands slightly raised, her steady gaze fixed on the officer. The calm in her demeanor only seemed to irritate Keller further. "I said hands where I can see them," Keller barked again, his tone harsher this time. Miss Eve, suppressing a wave of indignation, carefully placed her worn purse on the hood of her car. "Officer, I'm just here to pick up some groceries for my neighbor," she explained calmly. Keller's sharp eyes swept over her and her car. "Suspicious activity in this area," he muttered dismissively. As though her explanation was irrelevant, he began to circle her vehicle, peering through the windows like he was expecting to find something incriminating. Miss Eve's voice remained steady, though a flicker of irritation crept into her tone. "Suspicious activity? Officer, I've lived here for 40 years. Everyone in this town knows me." Keller stopped abruptly, turning to face her with a skeptical glare. "Step away from the vehicle," he snapped. Passers-by had begun to gather at a safe distance, their murmurs filling the air. Some peered cautiously from the diner windows across the street. An elderly man behind the pharmacy door shook his head but didn't step outside. "Sir, I assure you," Miss Eve began, but Keller interrupted. "Quiet," he snapped, pulling out his radio to mutter something inaudible. His partner, a younger officer who had been lingering near the cruiser, approached cautiously. Keller pointed to the sedan. "Search it," he ordered, ignoring Miss Eve's protests. The partner hesitated. Do we have probable cause?" he asked in a low voice. Glancing at the small crowd gathering nearby, Keller shot him a glare. "Do it," he growled. As the younger officer opened the passenger door and began rifling through Miss Eve's glove compartment, Keller seized her wrist and pulled her away from the car. The sudden, rough motion caused her to stumble slightly, her gray cardigan slipping from her shoulder. The crowd murmured louder, but no one intervened. Miss Eve's heart pounded as humiliation and anger mingled in her chest. "Is this really necessary?" she asked, her voice now trembling with controlled fury. Keller smirked, holding up her purse. "We'll see what's necessary once we figure out what you're hiding." Miss Eve squared her shoulders, refusing to let the officer's hostility intimidate her. "You're making a mistake," she said firmly, her voice regaining its steady tone. "Oh, we'll see about that," Keller sneered, clearly enjoying the spectacle he was creating. But Keller had no idea just how much of a mistake he was making. The harsh fluorescent lights of the police station greeted Miss Eve as Officer Keller marched her inside. Her cardigan was slightly askew, her wrist sore from the firm grip he'd maintained on her arm. Despite the sting of humiliation, she kept her head high, unwilling to let the circumstances break her dignity. Keller, on the other hand, seemed to relish the power he wielded, smirking as he led her to the booking desk. "Another troublemaker off the streets," Keller announced loudly, catching the attention of nearby officers. A few glanced up from their paperwork, their faces showing varying degrees of confusion. Miss Eve didn't fit the profile of the typical arrestee they were used to processing, and it showed in their hesitant expressions. The booking officer raised an eyebrow as Keller handed over the necessary paperwork. "What's the charge?" he asked, his tone neutral but clearly skeptical. "Suspicious activity," Keller said with a dismissive wave. She was lurking around a parked car. Could have been scoping out a break-in. Miss Eve bit back a sharp retort, knowing that any outburst might only make things worse. Instead, she took a deep breath and looked the booking officer directly in the eye. "I was helping a neighbor," she said calmly, and this officer chose to interpret kindness as a crime. The booking officer hesitated, his pen hovering over the forms. Keller glared at him, silently daring him to question the arrest. Reluctantly, the man proceeded, asking Miss Eve to remove her personal items and place them in a small plastic bin. Her worn purse, a symbol of her modest lifestyle, landed on the desk with a soft thud. Keller immediately began rifling through it, his movements brisk and invasive. He pulled out her wallet, flipping it open to examine her ID. "Evelyn Harris," he read aloud, smirking as he handed the ID back to the booking officer. "Well, Miss Harris, let's see if you've got anything else in here." He tossed her purse aside and began scribbling notes. The indignity of the moment was almost too much to bear, but Miss Eve held her composure. Years of facing subtle prejudice had taught her how to channel her anger into quiet strength. She remained silent, taking mental notes of every detail. The way Keller's voice dripped with condescension, the way his colleagues looked away instead of questioning his actions. A younger officer, standing by the door, leaned toward a colleague and muttered, "She doesn't seem like the type. Did you see her briefcase? That's not cheap." The other officer nodded, his eyes narrowing as he studied Miss Eve. "Something doesn't add up," he said under his breath. Keller, oblivious to the growing unease among his peers, continued with the booking process. He instructed Miss Eve to stand against the wall for her mugshot, barking at her to remove her cardigan when the fabric bunched awkwardly. She complied without a word, but her eyes burned with quiet defiance. By the time she was fingerprinted and escorted to a holding cell, whispers had begun to ripple through the station. Keller's colleagues exchanged uncertain glances, their initial support for him wavering as they observed Miss Eve's dignified demeanor. "She's not saying much," one officer remarked. "Doesn't need to," another replied. "Just look at her. She's not what Keller thinks she is." Inside the cold, stark cell, Miss Eve sat on a metal bench, her hands folded neatly in her lap, Her surroundings were unfamiliar and unsettling, but she refused to let fear consume her. Instead, she replayed the events in her mind, methodically cataloging every instance of Keller's misconduct. This wasn't just about her. This was about something much bigger, a system that allowed someone like Keller to act with impunity. I'll make this right, she thought, her resolve hardening, not just for me, but for anyone who's ever been treated like they don't matter. As the station buzzed around her, Miss Eve remained a picture of quiet strength. Biding her time, she knew that the truth would soon come to light, and when it did, it would shatter Keller's smug confidence and expose the injustice for all to see. The sun rose over the courthouse, casting long shadows across the steps as the morning crowd began to gather. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation, a mix of curiosity and tension hanging in the air. When Miss Eve was led inside, still in handcuffs, a wave of murmurs swept through the room. She walked with her head held high, her calm composure a stark contrast to the humiliation she'd endured. Officer Keller, seated near the front, leaned back with a smug grin. To him, this was just another routine case, a victory waiting to be sealed. He whispered to his partner, "This'll be over in no time. I'll finally get credit for cleaning up this town." Miss Eve took her place at the defendant's table, her dignified presence silencing much of the courtroom chatter. Her lawyer, a seasoned attorney with a sharp eye for injustice, whispered a few words of encouragement, but Miss Eve didn't need them. She exuded a quiet strength that seemed to fill the room. The presiding judge, a no-nonsense woman in her late 50s, entered the courtroom. Her piercing gaze swept over the room before she took her seat. "All rise," the bailiff called out, and the crowd obeyed, even in her cuffs. Miss Eve rose gracefully, maintaining her composure as the proceedings began. The charges were read aloud: resisting arrest, suspicious behavior, and other thinly veiled accusations that sounded absurd to anyone paying attention. Whispers broke out among the spectators, their skepticism about the charges evident. Keller, however, sat smugly, arms crossed, his confidence unshaken. As the judge reviewed the case files, her expression shifted. Her initially neutral demeanor gave way to furrowed brows and pursed lips. She flipped through the pages, pausing occasionally as if rereading something to ensure she wasn't mistaken. Finally, the judge raised her eyes, fixing them on Miss Eve, Miss Evelyn Harris. She began, her tone carrying a hint of incredulity. "Is this information accurate?" Miss Eve nodded, her calm gaze meeting the judge's. "Yes, Your Honor." The room fell silent, the tension palpable. The judge removed her glasses and leaned forward slightly, addressing the courtroom. For those who may not be aware, Miss Evelyn Harris is the newly appointed city judge. The revelation landed like a thunderclap. Gasps erupted across the room as spectators turned to one another in shock. Even Keller's partner looked stunned, his face pale as he glanced nervously at Keller. Keller's grin vanished instantly, replaced by a look of disbelief. "What?" he blurted out, his voice breaking the stunned silence. The judge's expression hardened as she addressed Keller directly. "Officer Keller, are you aware of whom you arrested yesterday?" Keller stammered, his bravado crumbling under the weight of the judge's words. I didn't know." "Your Honor." She didn't what? The judge interrupted sharply. Looked the part of a judge? Present herself as someone worthy of your respect? "Tell me, Officer Keller, what led you to escalate the situation?" The courtroom watched in stunned silence as Keller struggled to respond. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead as he muttered incoherent excuses about standard procedures and suspicious activity. Miss Eve stood, her voice calm but commanding. "Your Honor, may I address the court?" The judge nodded. "Please do." Miss Eve turned to face the room, her steady gaze sweeping across the sea of faces. "Yesterday, I was humiliated and treated like a criminal for doing nothing more than helping a neighbor. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was a result of a mindset that sees people like me as less deserving of respect, dignity, and humanity. That mindset must change." Her words hung in the air, powerful and unshakable. The courtroom erupted into whispers again, the weight of her statement impossible to ignore. As Keller shrank in his seat, Miss Eve turned to the judge. "I trust the justice system will handle this appropriately, Your Honor, but I will not let this experience go to waste. This is an opportunity to address the deeper issues that allowed it to happen." The judge nodded solemnly. "Miss Harris, I assure you, this will be addressed. Officer Keller, your actions will not go unchecked." Keller's world crumbled as the courtroom bore witness to his reckoning. For Miss Eve, the moment was a triumph, not just for her dignity, but for the justice she vowed to uphold. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs after Miss Eve's powerful statement, her poised demeanor contrasting sharply with Officer Keller's visible unraveling. The judge's expression was one of barely contained indignation as she addressed the officer. "Officer Keller," she began, her voice cold and precise, "your behavior yesterday was not only unacceptable, but a disgrace to the very badge you wear." Keller's bravado had evaporated. His confident smirk was now replaced with a pale, nervous countenance. He stammered, trying to justify his actions. "Your Honor, I was just following protocol." She looked suspicious. Suspicious? The judge cut him off sharply. "Your actions went far beyond mere suspicion. You escalated a peaceful situation into one of unnecessary aggression. Tell me, Officer Keller, what evidence did you have to warrant such treatment of Miss Harris?" Keller glanced around the room, searching for an escape. I thought the car might have been stolen," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. "Based on what?" the judge pressed. "Her appearance? Her age? Or perhaps her skin color?" The question hung in the air like a thunderclap. The courtroom went silent, save for the faint scribbling of a court reporter. Keller fumbled for words, but his excuses fell flat. His partner, seated nearby, shifted uncomfortably, clearly realizing the gravity of the situation. The judge leaned forward, her gaze unrelenting. "This isn't just about Miss Harris. Officer Keller, it's about what your actions represent, a systemic issue that erodes trust in law enforcement and endangers the very community you're supposed to protect. Your conduct yesterday was not just unprofessional. It was shameful." Keller's partner raised a hesitant hand. "Your Honor," he said quietly, I didn't mean to escalate things. I was just following his lead." The judge's piercing gaze shifted to him. "And that is precisely the problem. Complicity is no excuse. As an officer of the law, it is your duty to question and intervene when something isn't right, not to blindly follow poor judgment." She turned her attention back to Keller, effective immediately. "You are suspended from duty, pending a full investigation into your actions. This court will not tolerate abuse of authority, especially when it stems from racial bias." The announcement sent a ripple of murmurs through the room. Keller's face flushed as he slumped in his seat, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. Miss Eve watched the scene unfold, her expression composed but resolute, while the humiliation of the previous day still stung. Seeing Keller held accountable provided a measure of vindication. The judge continued, her tone firm. "Furthermore, this court will recommend mandatory sensitivity training for both of you. Law enforcement requires not only power but responsibility, and it's clear that you need to be reminded of that balance." As the session adjourned, Keller's suspension was a small but significant step toward justice. For Miss Eve, it marked the beginning of a broader fight for accountability and systemic change. News of the courtroom drama spread like wildfire. By the time Miss Eve returned home, clips of the incident, captured by bystanders, had already gone viral on social media. The footage showed Officer Keller aggressively detaining a calm and collected elderly woman, followed by the shocking revelation of her identity as the new city judge. Hashtags like #JusticeForEve and #EndRacial Profiling began trending within hours, igniting a nationwide conversation about systemic racism and abuse of power. Local news stations picked up the story first, interviewing witnesses who expressed outrage at Keller's behavior. "She's the sweetest woman you'll ever meet," said the young mother Miss Eve had helped earlier that day. "She didn't deserve to be treated like that." Another witness added, "If this can happen to someone as respected as Miss Harris, what does that say about how others are treated?" National media outlets soon followed, framing the story as a symbol of the urgent need for police reform. Headlines like "City Judge Racially Profiled by Police" and "Elderly Woman's Humiliation Sparks Outrage" dominated the news cycle. Pundits debated the incident on talk shows, while activists used it to amplify calls for justice and accountability in law enforcement. Protests erupted in the small town, with citizens rallying outside the police station and courthouse. Signs reading "No Justice, No Peace, and Accountability for All" filled the air as chants echoed down the streets. Community leaders organized town hall meetings to discuss the systemic issues highlighted by Miss Eve's experience. Many attendees shared their own stories of profiling and mistreatment, revealing the deep-rooted problems within the local police department. Amid the chaos, Miss Eve became an unlikely symbol of resilience and justice. She was inundated with requests for interviews, but she declined most, preferring to focus on her new role as judge. However, she released a short public statement that struck a chord nationwide. "This isn't just about me," she said. "It's about ensuring that no one, regardless of age, race, or background, is subjected to this kind of treatment again. We must demand better." Governor Harris, Miss Eve's cousin, also weighed in, delivering a scathing critique of law enforcement practices during a televised address. "This incident is a stark reminder of why we must push for comprehensive reforms," he stated. "Racial profiling and abuse of authority have no place in our society." The police department scrambled to manage the fallout. The chief of police issued a public apology, promising a thorough investigation into Keller's actions. Yet many in the community dismissed the gesture as performative, demanding real changes rather than empty words. As the story continued to dominate headlines, it became clear that Miss Eve's ordeal was more than an isolated incident. It was a catalyst for a broader reckoning, forcing the town and the nation to confront the ugly truths about racial bias and misuse of power. The fallout from Officer Keller's actions culminated in a formal disciplinary hearing. Held just days after the incident, the hearing was open to the public, and the courtroom was packed with spectators, media representatives, and community members eager to witness the outcome. The atmosphere buzzed with tension as Keller entered the room, his once confident demeanor now replaced with visible unease. He avoided eye contact with the audience, many of whom carried signs or wore buttons demanding accountability. As the proceedings began, the Internal Affairs representative stood to present their findings. "Officer Keller," she began, her tone crisp, "we reviewed the evidence, including video footage from the incident, body cam recordings, and eyewitness testimony. What we found is deeply troubling and indicative of a pattern of misconduct." The first piece of evidence was a compilation of bystander videos. The clip showed Keller roughly detaining Miss Eve, ignoring her explanations, and rifling through her personal belongings without cause. Each scene elicited audible gasps and murmurs from the audience. The footage left no room for interpretation. His actions were clearly excessive and unjustified. The Internal Affairs officer continued, detailing a troubling history in Keller's record. Over the past 3 years, he had been the subject of multiple complaints for racial profiling and overly aggressive behavior. Though these complaints had been dismissed at the time, the current incident cast them in a damning new light. "This is not an isolated event," the officer stated firmly. "It reflects a broader pattern of behavior that undermines public trust in law enforcement." Fellow officers were called to testify, and their accounts painted a picture of Keller as a man driven by bias and a need to assert authority. One officer reluctantly admitted, "Keller often made assumptions about people based on how they looked. We've tried to talk to him about it, but he always brushed it off." Another testified that Keller had once bragged about teaching a lesson to a black teenager who had done nothing wrong but walked through the wrong neighborhood. Keller sat stiffly through the testimonies, his face growing redder with each damning statement. When it was finally his turn to speak, he stood and cleared his throat, his voice shaky. I never intended for things to escalate the way they did," he began, I was just doing my job, trying to ensure public safety, his defense. However, quickly unraveled under questioning. When asked why he had targeted Miss Eve, Keller stumbled over his words. Her car looked out of place. He mumbled, and there's been reports of suspicious activity in that area. Reports that you cannot substantiate. The internal affairs officer interjected sharply. And yet you chose to detain and humiliate a respected member of this community. Why? Keller stammered. It wasn't personal. I didn't know who she was. Miss Eve, seated in the audience with quiet composure, leaned forward slightly at these words. Her expression was calm but unyielding. When given the opportunity to speak, she rose and addressed the panel with measured authority. It shouldn't matter who I am, she said, her voice clear and steady. Whether I'm a judge, a grandmother, or simply a person walking down the street, I deserve the same respect as anyone else. Officer Keller's actions were not just about me. They were about a mindset that sees certain people as less deserving of dignity. Her words hung in the air, silencing even the faintest whispers in the room. For the first time, Keller seemed to grasp the gravity of his actions. His shoulders slumped slightly, his eyes darting nervously between the panel and the audience. The hearing concluded with a decisive ruling. Keller was suspended without pay pending the completion of racial sensitivity training and mandatory community service. His partner, though less directly involved, was also reprimanded for failing to intervene. The department announced that it would begin an internal review of its training protocols and disciplinary policies to address systemic issues. As Keller left the courtroom, he was met with a mix of glares and disappointed shakes of the head from the audience. He had entered the hearing thinking he could talk his way out of trouble, but he left with his reputation in tatters. For Miss Eve, the hearing was a step toward justice, but it wasn't the end of her fight. She knew that true accountability would require more than punishing one officer. It would demand systemic change. As the audience filed out, many stopped to thank her for standing up and shining a light on an issue that had long been ignored. Miss Eve left the courthouse with her head held high, determined to ensure that this incident would be a catalyst for meaningful reform. The events of that day lit a fire within Miss Eve, one that she refused to let dim. Though she had stood her ground against Officer Keller's blatant abuse of power, she knew the problem ran deeper than one man's actions. It was a systemic issue, woven into the fabric of the town's policing practices. Miss Eve resolved to use her position as city judge and her newfound platform to fight for change, not just for herself, but for every person who had been silenced or mistreated. Her first step was to meet with community leaders. She called a town hall meeting, inviting activists, local officials, and everyday citizens to share their stories. The turnout was overwhelming. The room buzzed with energy and determination. People spoke of similar encounters with law enforcement, incidents that hadn't made headlines but had left lasting scars. A young black man recounted being stopped and searched on his way home from work. A Latina mother shared how officers treated her with suspicion every time she visited certain parts of town. Their voices blended into a powerful chorus, each testimony underscoring the urgency of reform. "We've been quiet for too long," Miss Eve said, standing before the crowd. Her calm but firm voice carried through the room. But no more. Change starts here, with us. Together, we can build a community where justice isn't just a word, it's a reality. Her advocacy quickly gained traction. Miss Eve collaborated with local organizations to develop a series of policy proposals aimed at combating racial profiling and ensuring greater transparency in law enforcement. These included mandatory racial bias training for all officers, the use of body cameras during interactions, and the establishment of a civilian oversight board to review misconduct complaints. In meetings with the police chief and town council, Miss Eve pushed relentlessly for these changes. She didn't shy away from calling out resistance when she encountered it. Accountability isn't an attack on law enforcement, she argued. It's how we build trust between officers and the communities they serve. Her logic was unassailable, and her personal story added weight to her words. Beyond policy making, Miss Eve took her message directly to the people. She began speaking at schools, churches, and community centers, sharing her experience and encouraging others to stand up against injustice. At one event, a teenage girl approached her with tears in her eyes. "I've always been scared to speak up," the girl admitted, "but seeing you fight back gives me hope." Miss Eve also found allies in unexpected places. A group of officers from the local precinct reached out to her, expressing their frustration with the department's culture of silence. "We want to do better," one officer admitted, "but we need leadership that supports us, not just protects the bad apples." Their willingness to speak out strengthened Miss Eve's resolve, and she worked with them to design training programs that emphasized empathy, accountability, and community engagement. Her efforts culminated in a statewide push for reform. With the help of Governor Bennett and other lawmakers, Miss Eve helped draft legislation requiring police departments to implement anti-bias protocols and increasing funding for community policing initiatives. The bill passed with overwhelming support, marking a major victory for the movement she had sparked. Through it all, Miss Eve remained grounded in her purpose. "This isn't just about me," she reminded audiences. "It's about creating a world where no one has to experience what I did, where every person is treated with the respect and dignity they deserve." By the end of the year, Miss Eve had not only transformed her small town, but also inspired communities across the state to demand better. Her advocacy proved that even in the face of prejudice and resistance, change was possible when fueled by courage and determination. Months had passed since the parking lot incident that had forever altered the trajectory of Officer Keller's life. The fallout had been swift and harsh: suspension from duty, public disgrace, and mandatory attendance at sensitivity training sessions. At first, Keller approached these consequences with anger and resentment, viewing himself as the victim of an overblown situation. But as time went on, cracks began to form in his defensive armor. The sensitivity training sessions were particularly eye-opening. Keller was required to sit in a room with others accused of similar misconduct, listening to personal stories of people who had endured racial profiling, unjust arrests, and the humiliation of being targeted based on their appearance. Each story forced him to confront the very real harm caused by his actions. One day, a middle-aged black man shared how a routine traffic stop had escalated into a life-altering ordeal for his family. Keller found himself unable to meet the man's eyes, his words striking uncomfortably close to home. The pivotal moment came during a community service program, where Keller worked with a youth mentorship group. One of the young boys asked him point-blank, "Why did you treat people like that?" The question, spoken with pure curiosity rather than malice, left Keller speechless. For the first time, he was forced to examine his biases, realizing how deeply they had been ingrained in his actions. Eventually, Keller reached out to Miss Eve, requesting a private meeting. She agreed, though with some hesitation. The meeting took place at a local community center, a neutral ground where Keller arrived visibly nervous, his usual bravado replaced by humility. "Miss Harris," Keller began, his voice trembling slightly, "I owe you an apology, no. More than that, I owe you an acknowledgement of the harm I caused." He took a deep breath, struggling to find the right words. "What I did that day was wrong. Plain and simple. I acted out of bias and arrogance. And I failed to see you as the person you are, a person who deserves respect, dignity, and fairness." Miss Eve listened intently, her expression calm but unreadable. When Keller finished, she paused, letting the weight of his words settle between them. "Officer Keller," she said finally, her tone measured, "apologies are a start, but they're not the end. Accountability is about action, not just words. What will you do to ensure this doesn't happen again to anyone?" Keller nodded, his resolve evident. "I've committed to becoming better," he said. "I've started mentoring new recruits, emphasizing empathy and respect. I want to be part of the change, not the problem." Miss Eve regarded him for a long moment before offering a small, approving nod. "If you're serious about this, then you have my forgiveness," she said. "But remember, true change is a journey, not a destination. The conversation ended on a note of cautious optimism, both of them understanding that while forgiveness was extended, the work of rebuilding trust had only just begun. The morning sun bathed the familiar parking lot in golden light as Miss Eve strolled through the community that had come to symbolize her resilience and strength. Gone was the shadow of that humiliating day. In its place was a vibrant neighborhood united by a shared sense of accountability and justice. Miss Eve's experience had become more than a local story. It was a catalyst for change. As the newly appointed city judge, she worked tirelessly to implement reforms that extended beyond her courtroom. Her rulings were thoughtful and balanced, earning her respect across the city. But it was her advocacy outside the courtroom that truly defined her legacy. She partnered with local organizations to lead workshops on racial bias, fostering honest conversations between law enforcement and citizens. Miss Eve also helped establish a program that paired officers with community members for shared activities, creating opportunities to build understanding and trust. Justice begins with connection, she often said, a motto that resonated deeply in the community. Officer Keller's journey was no less transformative. Under Miss Eve's guidance, he embraced his role as a mentor for younger officers, teaching them the hard lessons he had learned. Keller spoke openly about his mistakes at training sessions, warning against the dangers of unchecked bias and arrogance. Over time, his sincerity earned him a measure of redemption among those who had once condemned him. The small town itself underwent a shift. The incident had drawn national attention, and the community's response became a model for other cities, tackling issues of police reform. Policies were introduced mandating racial sensitivity training for all officers, alongside stricter oversight of misconduct complaints. The town's police department, once viewed with suspicion, began to rebuild trust through transparency and engagement. At the heart of it all was Miss Eve, who continued to serve as a beacon of hope and fairness. She often reflected on the events of that fateful day, drawing strength from the support of her neighbors and the determination to leave a better world for future generations. One evening, Miss Eve attended a town hall meeting where Keller stood at the podium, addressing a crowd that once viewed him with disdain. "I'm here to tell you that change is possible," he said. "It's not easy, and it doesn't happen overnight. But it starts with taking responsibility and listening to voices we've ignored for too long." His words were met with quiet nods and murmurs of agreement. As Miss Eve left the meeting, she paused to greet familiar faces, exchanging smiles and warm words. Her heart swelled with pride as she saw her town embracing the values she held dear: empathy, accountability, and justice. The story ended where it began, but everything had changed. As Miss Eve walked through the parking lot, a group of children waved and called out, "Hi, Judge Harris." She waved back, her heart filled with hope. For Miss Eve, the fight for justice was far from over, but the legacy she was building was one she knew would endure.